Let me tell you about a man named Wendell Price and a piece of land everyone in Hyde County, North Carolina, had already given up on long before he ever raised his hand at an auction. It was the second week of October, 1991, the kind of morning where the air smelled like wet pine and wood smoke, and the sky over the eastern coastal plain hung low and gray. The county auction was held inside an old tobacco warehouse on the edge of Swan Quarter, a small town built where the road simply ran out of land and the swamp took over. Inside the warehouse, folding metal chairs sat in crooked rows. Farmers stood along the walls in heavy work coats, holding paper coffee cups, talking quietly the way men talk when they are about to spend money they cannot really afford to spend. Now, here's what you need to understand about Hyde County before this story makes sense. The land out there is flat, truly flat. The soil is rich in the right places and useless in the wrong ones. And the difference between rich and useless is usually one thing: water. Where the water drains, you can grow tobacco, corn, soybeans, and cotton. Where the water sits, you can grow nothing at all. The piece of land going up for sale that morning sat on the wrong side of that boundary. 62 acres of half-flooded ground on the southern edge of the county, near the slow brown shoulder of Lake Mattamuskeet. The locals called it Hatcher's Bottom, after a family that had tried 3 times across 2 generations to drain it for cotton, and gone broke 3 times trying. The last Hatcher had abandoned the land in 1968. Since then, the property had been sitting in tax delinquency, waiting for someone foolish enough to take it off the county's hands. Nobody had been that foolish for 23 years. Among the men gathered along the warehouse wall that morning stood Wendell Price. He was 41 years old, and he did not look like the rest of them. He was lean instead of broad, and tall in a slightly stooped way, like a man who had spent too many years leaning over desks. He wore plain wire-rimmed eyeglasses, a thin gray-blonde beard kept short, and a brown corduroy jacket over a work shirt that had been ironed flat. His hands were not the hands of a farmer. They were the hands of a man who had spent 18 years grading papers and writing equations on a chalkboard. Wendell had been a science teacher at Hyde County High School from 1973 until the spring of 1989. He had married a woman named Helen, a librarian from Belhaven, in 1976. They had one daughter, Claire, born in 1978. Helen had died in February of 1988, a short illness, a cancer that moved faster than any of the doctors expected. Wendell finished out that school year because he did not know what else to do, then turned in his resignation in the spring of 1989 and went home to look after his mother. He took over the small piece of family land his father had left behind, only 14 acres, mostly soybeans, and tried to make it pay enough to keep the lights on. And during those same 2.5 years, almost every Saturday morning, Wendell had been driving south, alone, in his old white Ford pickup, out past Engelhard, down the rough gravel road that led to Hatcher's Bottom. He never told anyone. He took a thermos of coffee, a fold-up canvas chair, and a green spiral-bound field notebook from his teaching days. For hours at a time, he sat at the edge of that flooded ground and watched the water. He measured things. He counted things. He wrote things down. Now, here's the part that matters. While the rest of the county looked at Hatcher's Bottom and saw failure, a swamp where 3 families had broken their backs and lost everything, Wendell saw something else entirely. He saw stable water. He saw a thick lens of peaty clay holding rainwater year-round at a remarkably even temperature. He saw old drainage channels from the Hatcher era that had become slow, gentle inlets and outlets. He saw a pond system that nature had already half-built, waiting for somebody to finish the job in a way that worked with the land instead of fighting it. But he never said any of that out loud. Not at the feed store, not at church, not even to his daughter Claire, who was 13 years old and away at boarding school in Greenville on a scholarship. Wendell had learned a long time before that quiet observation outlasts loud opinion almost every single time. The auctioneer that morning was a man named Earl Fenner, a thin retired surveyor with a clip-on tie. Earl worked through the smaller parcels first. By 11 o'clock, he reached the piece everybody was waiting to laugh at. 62 acres, Earl announced, glancing down at his clipboard. Hatcher Tract, South County, opening bid, $2,200. The room shifted. A few men chuckled. Standing near the front, leaning on a folding chair with both hands, was a large red-faced man named Baxter Holloway. Baxter was 56 years old and owned the biggest tobacco operation in the county. Almost 900 acres of good high ground. He wore a clean checked shirt, and a fresh green John Deere cap. He had a voice that filled rooms, and he liked using it. Baxter laughed. "Earl," he called out, "tell me you ain't really gonna ask grown men for $2,000 to buy a frog pond." The warehouse laughed with him. Earl asked again. Nothing. He asked a third time, and that was when, near the back of the room, Wendell Price quietly raised his right hand. The room went still. Heads turned. Baxter looked over his shoulder, saw who it was, and broke into a grin wide enough for the front row to see. "Wendell," Baxter called out, loud and friendly, the way a man is friendly when he is about to make you the joke of the room. "You fixing to teach the frogs algebra?" The warehouse erupted. One man slapped his thigh. Another shook his head. Earl Fenner waited for the noise to die down, then looked at Wendell and lifted his gavel. $2,200 from Mr. Price. Anyone else? Silence. Going once. Going twice. Sold. The gavel struck the wooden block. And just like that, Hatcher's bottom belonged to a 41-year-old widowed schoolteacher. Wendell walked to the registration table without looking at anyone. He signed the paperwork with a slow, careful hand. He folded the deed once, slid it into the inside pocket of his corduroy jacket, and walked out into the gray October morning. The laughter followed him into the parking lot. He stood beside his pickup for a long moment and looked south, toward the lake, toward the land that was now his. $2,200 represented almost every dollar he had left in the world. If he was wrong about what was under that water, he and his mother were finished. But the facts in his green notebook said he was not wrong. He started the truck and drove south. And that's when everything quietly began. Out in eastern North Carolina, the flatness of the coastal plain is not just geography. It shapes how water behaves. Because the slope toward the ocean is so gentle, rainfall does not run off the way it does in the Piedmont. It pools, slowly migrates, and is held in place by underlying layers of peat and clay deposited over thousands of years. For most farming, this is a problem. For aquaculture, the controlled raising of fish in ponds, stable water depth, even temperatures, and slow natural drainage are the exact conditions commercial catfish operations spend large sums of money trying to recreate artificially. Part 2. Now here's what you need to understand about what happened next. Everyone in Hyde County expected Wendell Price to start digging drainage ditches. That's what every hatcher before him had tried to do, and that's what any sensible new owner would have done. The whole point of buying low land in eastern North Carolina was supposed to be turning it into highland. Wendell did the opposite. He didn't drain a single inch of it. For the entire winter of 1991 and into the spring of 1992, he hardly touched the property at all in a way that anyone could see from the road. He walked it. He measured it. He drove the perimeter in his pickup so many times that the old gravel road developed a fresh set of tire ruts that everybody knew belonged to him. From a distance, people thought he had simply lost his nerve. They were half right. He didn't know where to begin yet, but only because he was still listening to the land. Every Saturday morning, and most weekday afternoons after he finished work on his own soybean field, Wendell drove south with his canvas chair, his thermos, his green notebook, and now also a small wooden measuring stake and a pocket tape. He began mapping the property in a way nobody had ever bothered to map it before. He marked where the water sat deepest after a heavy rain. He marked where it sat shallowest by August. He measured the slow direction of flow between the old Hatcher drainage cuts. He tracked the temperature of the standing water at 6 in the morning, and again at 3 in the afternoon, week after week, until the patterns inside his notebook were as clear as the lines on a printed page. By February of 1992, Wendell had something the Hatchers had never had. He had data, years of it, neatly recorded in penciled columns, dated, cross-referenced. The story it told said that under the right kind of light hand, Hatcher's bottom was not a swamp at all. It was a natural pond system the land itself had been trying to become for a long time. But Wendell knew enough about himself to know that data alone could fool a man. So in March of 1992, he drove 3.5 hours west to Raleigh. That's where he met Dr. Mamie Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy was 64 years old, a recently retired ichthyologist from North Carolina State University. She had spent 31 years studying freshwater fish populations across the Southeast. Wendell had found her name in the back pages of a 1979 extension bulletin on pond construction, and after 2 letters and 1 slightly nervous phone call, she had agreed to meet him in her small office on the agricultural campus. He arrived carrying his green notebook, 3 years of soil and water samples in glass jars, and a hand-drawn map of Hatcher's Bottom rolled up in a cardboard tube. She spread the map across her desk and didn't say a word for almost 20 minutes. She just looked. She picked up the sample jars one at a time, held them to the window light, set them down. Then she opened the notebook and read his temperature columns the way another person might read a letter from home. When she finally looked up, she said, "Mr. Price, why on earth haven't you done this already?" That was the moment Wendell knew he had not imagined it. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Kennedy walked him through what he had been quietly suspecting for months. The stable peaty subsoil, the slow lateral flow, the temperature range, the natural inlet patterns, all of it pointed toward one specific use of the land, and only one: channel catfish, pond aquaculture, the same industry that had quietly built itself into a $500 enterprise across Mississippi and Alabama during the 1980s, but which almost nobody in eastern North Carolina was doing yet at any real scale. She told him exactly what to do. Don't drain, deepen. Take the natural low points and gently shape them into a series of connected ponds, 2 to 4 acres each, no deeper than 5.5 feet. Build simple wooden control gates at the old Hatcher drainage cuts. Stock late spring. Feed twice daily. Harvest in the second autumn. You already know the land, she said. I'm just telling you what it's been telling you. He drove home that night, and for the first time since Helen had died, he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in nearly 4 years. He felt a future. That spring, Wendell went to work. Quietly. He rented a small backhoe from a man in Bellevin and started deepening the natural low points the way Dr. Kennedy had drawn. He worked alone most days, sometimes from before sunrise until after dark. He built 4 simple wooden water control gates at the old Hatcher cuts. He didn't hire a crew, didn't take a loan, didn't tell anyone what he was building. From the gravel road, all anyone could see was a thin man in a brown corduroy jacket moving slowly through wet ground. The mockery did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. Baxter Holloway, in particular, seemed to have developed a personal fondness for the joke. Every time Wendell came into the feed store in Engelhard, Baxter, if he was there, would call out something across the room. "How's the frog farm coming along, Professor?" The other farmers would laugh, and Wendell would simply nod, pay for his supplies, and walk out. He never argued. He had nothing yet to show, and a man without proof should never waste his voice. By late April of 1992, the first 2 ponds were ready. Dr. Kennedy connected Wendell with a small hatchery operation outside Goldsboro. In early May, on a humid Tuesday morning, Wendell drove 3 hours west with an empty oxygenated transport tank in the bed of his truck and drove back that afternoon with 1,800 fingerlings, each about 3 inches long, swimming in cool, aerated water. He released them himself, 1 bucket at a time, into the first pond just after sunset. The light was going gold over the flat horizon, and the cicadas were starting up in the pines. He stood there for almost an hour after the last bucket had emptied, just watching the still surface of the water. Through the summer of 1992, Wendell fed the fish twice a day, exactly the way Dr. Kennedy had instructed. He kept a separate log and a second notebook, brown this time, where he recorded every feed weight, every water temperature, every observation. The fingerlings grew faster than he expected. By August, they were 6 inches long. By October, nearly 9. By the spring of 1993, anyone driving past Hatcher's Bottom on a clear evening could see something that had never been there before. Neat rectangular ponds with grass-covered banks, 4 wooden gates standing straight along the old cuts, and a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses walking the levees with a clipboard. People still laughed, but the laughter had started to sound a little different, less certain, like men who could feel the joke shifting under their feet but weren't yet ready to admit it. Channel catfish farming in the United States grew dramatically through the 1980s, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, but its expansion into the Carolinas came significantly later and unevenly. Successful pond aquaculture depends less on having the right climate than on having the right combination of soil, slope, and water stability. A grower with patient observation and a willingness to study local conditions can often outperform larger operations, relying solely on imported best practices. In agriculture, listening to the specific piece of land in front of you has always quietly outperformed copying what worked somewhere else. Part 3. Now I want you to picture a hot August afternoon in 1994. The kind of afternoon in eastern North Carolina where the air sits heavy on your shoulders, and the cicadas don't stop until well after dark. By that point, Wendell Price had been working Hatcher's Bottom for almost 3 years. He had 4 ponds in active production, 2 more under construction, and 23,000 pounds of channel catfish swimming somewhere on his 62 acres at any given moment. And almost nobody in Hyde County still knew what was actually happening down there. That changed on the 18th of August. A wholesale seafood buyer named Floyd Markham drove down from Raleigh that morning in a refrigerated truck with the name Markham & Sons, seafood painted in faded blue letters across the side. Floyd had been buying fish from Mississippi for years, but in the spring he had heard, through Dr. Kennedy, that there was a small operation in eastern North Carolina worth looking at. On the third call, in early August, Wendell had finally said, "Come down. We're ready." The first harvest happened that afternoon. Wendell, with the help of 2 part-time hands he had quietly hired from Engelhard, pulled the seine net through Pond 1 for the first time. Floyd stood on the levee in a short-sleeved shirt and watched. When the net came up the bank, it was so heavy that all 3 men together had to drag it the last few feet. The fish moved like silver inside the mesh, hundreds of them, each one between 2 and 3 pounds. Floyd weighed them in the truck on a hanging scale. The first load alone came to just over 3,000 pounds. He wrote a check, right there on the tailgate, for almost $9,000. He told Wendell he would be back in 2 weeks for the next pond, and back again in 6 weeks for the pond after that. Wendell did not celebrate. He drove into Swan Quarter that evening, deposited the check at the county bank where the same teller who had watched him scrape by for 3 years did not quite manage to keep the surprise off her face, and drove home. He sat on the porch with his mother and ate supper. He did not tell anyone what had happened. Not yet. But word travels in small counties the way water travels in flatland, slowly and then suddenly. By the end of September, 3 more wholesale buyers had visited the property. By the end of October, Wendell had signed standing seasonal contracts with restaurants in New Bern, Greenville, and Wilmington. By November, the Hyde County Herald sent a young reporter out to write a short article about the unusual sight of a working fish farm on what used to be the Hatcher Tract. The article appeared on a Thursday. It carried a headline that read, "Former Teacher's Pond System Quietly Becomes One of the Region's First Catfish Operations." By Friday morning, almost everyone in the county had read it. And here's where the story turns. Baxter Holloway read it at the feed store in Engelhard, standing in the corner where the free coffee pot sat, holding the paper in both hands. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, set it down on the counter, and walked out without saying anything to anyone. The men at the feed store told that story for years afterward. The silence of Baxter Holloway walking out without a joke. 2 weeks later, on a cold morning in early December, Baxter's red pickup pulled up at the gate of Hatcher's Bottom. Baxter sat in the truck for almost 10 minutes before he got out. When he finally walked up the gravel drive, Wendell was standing on the levee of Pond 3, writing something in his green notebook. He looked up, saw who it was, and waited. Baxter walked up the levee slowly. He took off the John Deere cap and held it in both hands in front of him. He was 59 years old now, and he looked it. The redness in his face that day was not from temper. It was from shame, the honest kind, which is the hardest kind for a proud man to wear in front of someone he has wronged. He stood there for a long moment looking out across the ponds. Then he said very quietly, "Wendell, I was wrong." That was all. 3 words. But the weight behind them was the weight of 3 years of mockery in front of half the county. Wendell closed his notebook. He did not say anything immediately. He looked out across Pond 3 the same way Baxter was looking. The water was still that morning, and you could see the breath of the fish breaking the surface in little circles. After a long moment, Wendell said, "Come on, let me show you how it works." And he did. He spent the next 2 hours walking Baxter the entire length of the property. He showed him every pond, every water control gate, every feeding station. He explained the seine harvest, the oxygen monitoring, the seasonal cycles. He answered every question Baxter asked, patiently, the same way he used to answer questions in a high school biology classroom in 1978. He never once mentioned what Baxter had said about him at the auction. He never once mentioned the feed store comments. When they reached the truck again, Baxter put his cap back on his head. He looked at Wendell for a long moment, then stuck out his hand. Wendell shook it. That was the end of the laughter in Hyde County. Not because anyone made an announcement, not because anyone wrote a follow-up article, but because the man who had started the joke had quietly walked it back. And in a small county, that is enough. By the spring of 1995, Wendell had 8 ponds in production and was selling close to 90,000 pounds of catfish a year. He hired his first full-time employee, a young man from Englehart named Theo Whitfield, who had been laid off from a textile mill that winter. By the end of 1996, 3 more local men were working at Hatcher's Bottom full-time. The land that had stood empty for 23 years was now feeding families across the county. An independent appraiser came down from Greenville in the summer of 1996 and valued the property at slightly over $400,000. Wendell did not particularly care about the number. He had not bought the land because it was cheap. He had bought it because after 3 years of Saturday mornings with a green notebook and a thermos of coffee, he had understood it. The first commercial wholesale buyer of farmed catfish in any region is almost always the most important relationship a new grower will form. Wholesale buyers and regional seafood distribution networks rely heavily on word of mouth among themselves, and a single reliable supplier in a new geographic area can rapidly become the anchor for an entire local industry. By the late 1990s, the eastern North Carolina aquaculture sector that grew up around Hyde and surrounding counties would supply restaurants from the Outer Banks to the Piedmont. Much of it traceable back to a small handful of early producers willing to invest patient years before they ever saw a profit. Part 4. Now let me take you forward. Not by a year, not by 2, but by more than 2 decades. It was the second week of October in 2018. Almost exactly 27 years to the day after a thin schoolteacher in a brown corduroy jacket had raised his hand inside an old tobacco warehouse in Swan Quarter and bought a swamp for $2,200. The light over Hatcher's Bottom that morning was the same flat gray it had been on auction day, but everything else had changed. Wendell Price was 68 years old now. His hair had gone almost entirely white. The wire-rimmed glasses were thicker than they used to be, and he walked a little slower along the levees, the way men walk when their knees have started keeping their own counsel. The thin gray-blonde beard he had worn for years was full white now, trimmed short the way it had always been. But his eyes behind the glasses were the same eyes, still patient, still careful, still watching the water. The property looked nothing like the swamp he had bought. There were now 14 ponds in active production across the 62 acres, each one between 2 and 4 acres in size, connected by a careful network of wooden control gates and gravel levees wide enough for a small truck to drive. There were 2 large equipment sheds, a feed silo, a small office building with a tin roof, and a refrigerated holding facility along the eastern edge. 6 full-time employees worked the property. The annual output had grown to nearly 400,000 pounds of channel catfish, sold across the eastern half of the state. But none of that was Wendell's greatest accomplishment anymore. His greatest accomplishment was walking the levee beside him that morning. His daughter Claire Price was 40 years old now. She had earned her bachelor's degree in biology from NC State in 1999, and her master's in aquaculture science from Auburn in 2002. She had come home to Hyde County in 2004 and had taken over the day-to-day operations of the farm in 2012. She was tall and thin like her father, with her mother's dark hair pulled back and the same quiet, careful way of speaking that Wendell had carried his whole life. And walking just ahead of them both that morning, a few steps in front along the levee, was a 14-year-old boy with sandy hair and bright blue eyes who could not stop asking questions. His name was Samuel Whitfield, Claire's son, Wendell's grandson. He had been born in 2004, and he had been walking these levees since he was old enough to walk anywhere. He had inherited his grandfather's curiosity the way some children inherit a face. That morning, Samuel kept turning around and walking backwards to ask Wendell questions. Why is Pond 7 a foot deeper than Pond 8? Why do we always harvest Pond 3 before Pond 5? Why does the water in the southern ponds run 2 degrees cooler in August than the water on the north side? Wendell answered every question, the same way he had answered students in a biology classroom 45 years before. Sometimes he answered immediately. Sometimes he said, "Walk Pond 7 with me later, and tell me what you see." Some answers a man has to find with his own eyes before they will mean anything. Inside the small office at the eastern end of the property, on a shelf above Wendell's desk, sat a row of worn notebooks. There were 43 of them now. The oldest, the green spiral-bound one Wendell had carried in 1989 and 90 and 91, was cracked along the spine, its pages yellowed and soft with age. Inside were the original observations, the temperature columns, the water depth measurements, the hand-drawn maps of the old Hatcher drainage cuts. Then 42 more notebooks, one per season. Claire had read every single one of those notebooks. So had Samuel, at least the early ones. Wendell had told them both, more than once, that the notebooks were not for him anymore. They were for whoever came next. One afternoon in late October, an agricultural reporter from the Raleigh paper drove down to Hatcher's Bottom to write a piece about the farm. Wendell walked her around the property for almost 3 hours and showed her every levee. Near sunset, they ended up standing together at the edge of Pond 1. The first pond, the original pond. The one where 1,800 catfish fingerlings had been released by hand on a humid Tuesday evening in May of 1992. The reporter looked at the water for a moment. Then she asked the question she had been carrying with her all afternoon. "Mr. Price," she said, "what was your secret? How did you know?" Wendell smiled. He had been asked that question, in one form or another, more times over the years than he could count. The answer had never changed. He looked out across the water for a long moment before he spoke. "There's no such thing as worthless land," he said. "Only land nobody bothered to listen to." The reporter waited, expecting more. There wasn't any more. That truly was the answer. The article ran the following Sunday. It was a full half-page, with a color photograph of Wendell, Claire, and Samuel standing together on the levee above Pond 1. For weeks afterward, Wendell received letters from young farmers, retired engineers, school teachers, and dreamers. People from as far away as Virginia and South Carolina. He answered every letter himself, by hand. He simply told them what Dr. Mamie Kennedy had told him in a small office in Raleigh almost 3 decades earlier. He told them to listen to the land in front of them. He told them to write down what they saw, week after week, season after season, for as long as it took. He told them that patience was not a virtue. Patience was the work itself. Dr. Kennedy had passed away in 2009. Baxter Holloway had died in 2014. The two men had become, in their later years, something close to friends. At Baxter's funeral, Wendell had been one of the pallbearers. One evening in November of 2018, just at sunset, Wendell walked alone to the small office and sat at his desk. He took down the original green notebook from 1989, the one with the cracked spine, and laid it open on the windowsill where the last light of the day was coming in through the glass. The pages of his own young handwriting looked back at him, a thin teacher's careful pencil columns, dated and steady, charting the slow, patient story of a piece of land nobody else had been willing to read. Outside the window, the sun was settling down over the ponds. The water reflected the last gold of the day, and somewhere out along the southern levee, a 14-year-old boy was walking with his mother, asking questions about why the water in Pond 11 took a half day longer to warm than the water in Pond 10. Wendell didn't say anything. He just sat there for a long time, watching the light fall across the pages of the notebook on the sill, watching the ponds beyond the glass. The green notebook on the windowsill caught the last of the light, and outside the water kept moving. Generational knowledge transfer in agriculture is often more economically valuable than the land itself. Specialized operations like aquaculture, organic farming, and certain specialty crops can take a decade or more of close observation to truly master, and that observational knowledge rarely exists in textbooks. When a farmer makes a deliberate, patient effort to teach the next generation not only what to do, but why each decision matters and how to read the specific land underfoot, the operation becomes far more resilient across decades than any equipment purchase or land acquisition can ever make it.